All right, finally, I want to just encourage you that you can make a difference with regard to leadership. So sometimes Christians don't believe they can make a difference. This is an objection to leadership. They get discouraged, or they feel like, again, it is somehow offensive to God. They should just be quiet and submit to their leaders. They should submit to what has been handed down to them. They can't make a difference. They are just to, pass on faithfully what they have received. And I want to press back on that and say, no, I think you are called to make a difference, and I think you can make a difference. Individual decisions and actions affect others, and that is part of the Christian moral vision, is to make a difference. I'll also just give some secular quotes here and ideas about making a difference. We sometimes think that leaders don't make a difference. I really was moved a long time ago. This came out, this study of management, this massive study done by Gallup, and it was published in the book First Break All the Rules, What the World's Greatest Managers Do Differently in 1999. Marcus Buckingham and Kurt Kaufman write that one of their main things they found was that a good manager, a good leader, a good supervisor makes a huge difference in companies. Employees rated the questions differently. That's like their satisfaction with work questions, depending on which business unit they worked for rather than which company. This meant that for the most part, these 12 opinions were being formed by the employee's immediate manager rather than by the policies or procedures of the overall company. We had discovered that the manager, not pay, benefits, perks, or a charismatic corporate leader, was the critical player in building a strong workplace. People leave managers, not companies. And just to emphasize this, this is extremely difficult to measure. Human behavior is very difficult to measure. It's hard to figure out to just isolate one factor when we do psychological research on organizations. However, what they found is that in certain groups, under a certain manager, all the employees in that group or in that section would give positive, would answer the 12 employee satisfaction, employee effectiveness kind of questions in a positive manner. Whereas in the exact same company who did the exact same thing in a unit over here, they would have a whole different set of responses. And so it wasn't the benefits. They all had the same perks. They all had the same benefits. They all had the same, corporate purpose, that sort of thing. And so they had the same pay, but the individual units, the teams, had different responses. And so they came to see, hey, leaders make a difference. The managers make a difference. I know that's kind of obvious to you. Maybe if you've had a bad coach on a team, a bad choir director, you've had a bad teacher in school, a bad professor, and you're like, yeah, we're all miserable. It makes a difference. And I just think that I want to emphasize to you that you make a difference. The people under you, you make a difference to them. And how you act makes a huge difference. And I just want to encourage you in that, oftentimes once we become leaders, we almost get numb to the fact that we really do make the lives different for those under us and who we have influence over. But this study and others really do emphasize the rather basic point that you make a difference. Just another study of this from a different person, Ethan Mollick, in his study entitled People and Process, Suits and Innovators, the Role of Individuals in Firm Performance from 2012. He writes this: forget 10x engineers, aim for 10x product managers. What he means is like people who are like way better, 10 times better engineers. I'm looking for the very best engineers who are like geniuses. He says, no, instead, look for really good managers, people who oversee people. He says, my paper shows the difference in quality among managers in the video game industry. He says they're called producers in that setting. But he says, my paper shows the difference in quality among managers in the video game industry accounted for 22% of variation in game revenue, much more than any other role. So it wasn't the engineers, but it was really the managers of the individual units that made a difference. And another study is identity leadership and good leadership. And these researchers call that identity leadership. It matters for reducing the burnout of employees in an international study. So in this study, identity leadership, employee burnout, and the mediating role of team identification, evidence from the Global Identity Leadership Development Project. The people who responded, the leader is a model member of the group. The leader acts as a champion for the group. The leader creates a sense of cohesion within the group. And the leader creates structures that are useful for group members. Just those 4 things. If they scored high on those things, leader was a good example, they advocated for the group, they created a sense of cohesion, they created useful structures, those contributed to much less burnout within that team or that group. So again, it just makes a difference. And maybe you don't need to be reminded of this, but I just want to encourage you that the time you spend trying to help your team function better towards the goal really does make a difference. Agency matters, decisions matter, leadership matters, history tells us so, social science tells us so, Jesus tells us so. What you do matters. What someone does affects those around them. It's very easy to get discouraged or forget that what you do matters, but it does. Peter in 1 Peter writes, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? You are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but be made alive in the Spirit. So he's saying, hey, do your part. It will have great results. If you do what is right, you will be blessed. That's sort of what he says here in 1 Peter 3, 13 and 14. But then he goes on to temper what he's just written. So he says, if it is God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body. So all that to say, he then turns and says, however, this might not always bring the results. So I just want to say, you too, as you are to do good, and I think usually you will be blessed. You will get good results. Who will want to harm you if you are doing good? But as Peter also tempers his words, he says, however, Christ suffered too, and he was put to death. And so it may not work out statistically, even though I've just kind of shared some stats, and Peter too is optimistic that in general doing good leads to good results. And Leslie Newbegin said this as well, that I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. In other words, he's saying, we're not to be as Christians, pessimists or optimists. So some of the literature I've given you says, hey, be a good leader. You can make a difference. And yet it doesn't always work out that way. But also you can get discouraged, and Jesus is risen from the dead. So that's not the end, even if things go wrong. And so all that to say, when we think about results and making a difference, I want to encourage you with all those sociological studies that you do make a difference, but you can still get sabotaged. Things can still go wrong, but that is not the end. We as Christians can think beyond that and say, Jesus can bring triumph over things, even though it may appear that we were sabotaged or brought down or fired or somebody was successful in undermining our leadership. So that's a better way of thinking about results. Karl Barth also gives us some good reminders about this, saying we can't do anything in terms of the results, but we can respond to the Spirit, and the Spirit then also brings results. So how he describes the 3 chapters on the church in his church dogmatics is he puts the Spirit first. So he says the Holy Spirit and the gathering of the Christian community, the Holy Spirit and the upbuilding of the Christian community, the Holy Spirit and the sending of the Christian community. And so what I want to say to you is, it is probably best for you to think in your mind that you are thinking about the Holy Spirit and leading this church, the Holy Spirit and leadership. So you're trying in your mind theologically to say, God is at work before me. He is at work and I am joining in with him. And I don't want to forget his primary preeminence here in this work. So if you're wanting to be theologically precise, remember that the Spirit precedes us from this work, and the Spirit also is the one who finishes the work. But I want to say, Karl Barth also says we must still try something. And what Barth says is that even though we want to emphasize the primary nature of the Spirit's work, that doesn't mean we do nothing. So he says, if Christians cannot do what the Spirit does, and they should not pretend that they can, they may and should follow him in what he does. Even the most stringent self-criticism must never be a reason or occasion for prudently doing nothing. Better something overbold than nothing at all. So the point is here that even somebody like Karl Barth, who's sort of famous for emphasizing God's sovereignty, for emphasizing that we have to be careful of speaking out of turn and saying what we do and what we accomplish, that the Holy Spirit comes first and the Holy Spirit is the one that does the work. It doesn't mean we use that as an excuse to do nothing. Better something overbold than nothing at all. In other words, to act. He noticed, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in one of his classes. That was Karl Barth's first exposure to Dietrich Bonhoeffer when Bonhoeffer raised his hand and said something like, sin boldly. He was quoting Martin Luther in that. And the truth is, we are not wanting to sin. However, what Luther meant there, what Bonhoeffer meant there, what Barth meant there, is that sometimes we are so nervous about sinning, we are so trying to be respectful of the Lord that we will not act at all. And that distorts the courage that we are invited into by the Spirit to act, to respond, to sin boldly, to better do something overbold than nothing at all. Another way I've really appreciated is John Perkins, person who was involved in the civil rights movement and is a Christian and has been a light for racial reconciliation and for justice. And he says this, he says, as I look at the leaders I would follow, I think of men and women who actually enter into the real pain, suffering, and agony of the people. They act. They see pain, they respond, and they enter into it. They're not afraid to act. And that's what Perkins notices. And he tells a story that inspired him from Joshua 3:7, where the Lord said to Joshua, tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. And what Perkins says is, he says, once you get involved, you begin to feel it. I illustrate with crossing the Jordan. The water didn't part until they waded out into the water. And so, again, along these lines, we are aware that we are not to lead as the pagans do, not so with us. But that is not to prevent us from as John Perkins says here, to begin acting, to take steps into the water and to see what God might do as we try to obey him.